The stench of Nexus Station hit Captain Jake Morrison like a physical blow the moment he stepped off his cargo ship's boarding ramp. Recycled air, thick with industrial fumes, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smell of black market dealings created an atmosphere that made his nose burn and his eyes water. The docking bay's dim lighting cast everything in sickly yellow hues that made the already grimy surroundings look diseased. "Another paradise," Jake muttered, checking the power readings on his data pad. The Wanderer's fuel reserves showed critical levels, barely enough for one more hyperspace jump, maybe two if he pushed the engines beyond safety parameters. 3 months without a decent cargo contract had drained his resources and his options. Nexus Station existed in the gray area between civilized space and the lawless frontier, making it a magnet for traders, smugglers, and worse. Jake had come here hoping to find legitimate salvage work or emergency freight contracts that might keep his one-man operation afloat for another few weeks. The alternative was selling his ship and finding passage back to human space as a passenger, the kind of defeat that made his stomach clench with more than hunger. The main concourse buzzed with activity that felt simultaneously energetic and threatening. Merchants hawked questionable goods from improvised stalls, while security drones hummed overhead, their sensors scanning for weapons and contraband with mechanical indifference to the moral ambiguity of their surroundings. Jake navigated through crowds of aliens and humans, whose body language suggested they were all engaged in transactions they wouldn't want officially documented. Fresh salvage opportunities on Level 7, called a Centaurian trader, whose multiple arms gestured toward data displays showing spacecraft debris and abandoned cargo. Premium rates for experienced pilots with fast ships. Jake paused to examine the salvage listings, calculating fuel costs against potential profits with the grim mathematics of someone whose margin for error had vanished weeks ago. Most of the opportunities required more resources than he possessed, while the profitable ones demanded equipment upgrades he couldn't afford. "Captain Morrison." A voice behind him carried the distinctive harmonics of Rigelian speech. "I represent certain interests that might have worked for an independent operator." Jake turned to find a tall alien, whose expensive clothing didn't quite hide the predatory gleam in his multifaceted eyes. Rigelians had a reputation for profitable but morally questionable business ventures, exactly the kind of work Jake had been trying to avoid since his military discharge. "Depends on the work," Jake replied carefully. "I run legitimate cargo operations, not smuggling or weapons transport." Of course," the Rigelian replied with obvious insincerity. "Vex Korthak runs very legitimate operations. Perhaps you would be interested in viewing some of our premium goods before making hasty judgments about business opportunities." The name Korthak triggered recognition that made Jake's blood run cold. The Korthak Syndicate had a reputation throughout the outer systems for trafficking in things that civilized species preferred not to acknowledge existed: weapons, drugs, information, and worse. But Jake's fuel situation was desperate enough that even questionable cargo contracts deserved consideration. "What kind of goods?" Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Exotic biologicals," the Rigelian replied. "Very rare, very valuable. Buyers throughout the galaxy pay premium prices for authentic specimens." Jake followed the alien through corridors that grew progressively more isolated from the station's main traffic areas. Warning signs in multiple languages indicated restricted access zones, while the air grew thicker with the smell of industrial chemicals and something organic that made his stomach turn. The holding area occupied a section of the station that had been retrofitted with security systems more appropriate for a prison than a commercial facility. Reinforced doors, energy barriers, and armed guards suggested that whatever was being stored here wasn't being kept voluntarily. "Magnificent specimens," the Rigelian said with pride, gesturing toward a series of containment cells that lined both walls of the corridor. "Silari, captured from their homeworld after months of careful hunting. Very difficult to acquire, almost impossible to keep in captivity. Jake felt his breakfast threatening to make a return appearance as he realized what he was looking at. The cells contained young aliens, children and teenagers, whose distinctive silver hair and pointed ears marked them as members of a species he'd encountered during his military service. The Solari were known for their psychic abilities and fierce independence, qualities that made them fascinating to xenobiologists and apparently profitable to traffickers. "These aren't goods," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "These are people." "Technically correct," the Rigelian agreed with casual indifference. "But they're destined for the exotic meat markets in the Kolar system. Solari flesh is considered a tremendous delicacy. The psychic abilities apparently enhance the flavor profile." Jake stared at the cells, processing the implications of what he'd been shown. The Solari in the containment units looked malnourished and traumatized, their natural luminescent markings dim with stress and poor treatment. Most huddled in corners of their cells, but one, a girl who couldn't be more than 17, stood defiantly at the front of her enclosure. Her silver hair hung in tangled strands around pointed ears that twitched with awareness as Jake approached. Despite obvious signs of abuse and starvation, her posture radiated the kind of unbroken defiance that suggested her captors hadn't succeeded in breaking her spirit. "That one is special," the Rigelian observed, following Jake's gaze to the defiant girl. "Completely untamable, despite months of conditioning. Solari psychology makes them literally prefer death to submission, very inconvenient for livestock management." Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him as he made eye contact with the girl. Her expression carried a mixture of wariness and desperate hope, as if she could sense something different about him compared to her other visitors. When she pressed her hand against the energy barrier separating them, Jake saw the subtle luminescence of her palm markings flicker in what might have been an attempt at communication. "Auction begins tomorrow morning," the Rigelian continued. "Premium specimens like her will fetch excellent prices from discriminating buyers. Very fresh, very tender, guaranteed authentic Solari heritage." Jake's military training kicked in as he calculated guard positions, security systems, and potential escape routes, while maintaining the appearance of a potential customer examining merchandise. The girl seemed to sense his tactical assessment, her head tilting slightly as if she could read his intentions through some form of psychic awareness. "How much for immediate purchase?" Jake asked, though he knew his answer before the question was complete. "For her, 50,000 credits minimum, plus handling fees, transportation costs, and buyer verification procedures." The Rigelian smiled with predatory satisfaction. Of course, serious buyers might be interested in volume discounts for multiple specimens. Jake nodded noncommittally, while his mind raced through calculations that all led to the same impossible conclusion. He had maybe 3,000 credits to his name, barely enough fuel for one hyperspace jump, and no resources to mount any kind of rescue operation against a heavily guarded criminal syndicate. Walking away would be the rational choice, the smart choice that might keep him alive and his ship operational for a few more weeks. But as he looked into the defiant girl's eyes, Jake realized that some choices couldn't be made based on rational calculations alone. "I'll need time to arrange financing," he told the Rigelian. "Can I get another look at the merchandise tomorrow before the auction?" "Naturally," the alien replied. "Vex Korthak always accommodates serious buyers. Just remember, Solari meat is best consumed fresh, so delivery scheduling will be quite important for maintaining quality." Jake left the holding area with his decision already made, despite the certain knowledge that attempting a rescue would cost him everything he owned, and probably get both him and the girl killed in the process. But some things mattered more than fuel reserves and profit margins. The untamable alien girl was going to be saved, even if it took his last drop of fuel to do it. Jake spent the night in a dingy station hostel, but sleep proved impossible as his mind cycled through rescue scenarios that all ended badly. The Wanderer's cargo manifest listed him as a single-person crew with minimal defensive capabilities. Hardly the profile of someone equipped to take on an established criminal syndicate. But military training had taught him that impossible missions sometimes succeeded when desperation met careful planning and absolute commitment. Dawn Cycle brought him back to the Korthak Syndicate's compound with a data pad full of fabricated financial credentials and a story about representing buyers in the luxury food markets. The same Rigelian from yesterday greeted him with enthusiasm that suggested word had spread about a potentially profitable customer. Captain Morrison, excellent timing. We're preparing premium specimens for today's viewing session. The alien gestured toward the holding area where increased activity suggested preparation for the announced auction. Several buyers have expressed particular interest in our untamable Solari. Jake followed him through security checkpoints that cataloged weapons, recorded biometric data, and generally made it clear that leaving unauthorized would be more difficult than entering. The precautions seemed excessive for a livestock auction, until Jake remembered that Solari psychic abilities made them dangerous even in captivity. The holding area had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a livestock show, with viewing platforms and assessment stations where potential buyers could examine their future meals. Jake felt his stomach clench as he watched well-dressed aliens discuss the relative merits of terrified children, with the clinical detachment of gourmets selecting dinner ingredients. Observe the muscle definition on this specimen. A Centaurian buyer was telling his companion while a young Solari boy cowered in his examination cage. Youth ensures tenderness, but adequate exercise maintains proper texture. Jake forced himself to maintain the role of interested customer, while every instinct screamed at him to start shooting syndicate personnel and damn the consequences. The girl from yesterday, he still didn't know her name, occupied a premium viewing station where her defiant attitude was being marketed as evidence of spirit that would enhance flavor profiles. "Ah, here is our star attraction," the Rigelian announced, leading Jake toward the girl's containment area. Complete psychological resistance to conditioning, which maintains the stress hormones that sophisticated palates appreciate. The girl looked up as Jake approached, her expression shifting from general hostility to focused attention, as she seemed to recognize him from their previous encounter. When their eyes met, Jake felt a strange tingling sensation in his mind, not quite telepathy, but some form of psychic contact that conveyed urgency and desperate hope. "She's trying to communicate," Jake observed, stepping closer to her containment field. Solari psychic abilities persist even under extreme duress, the Rigelian explained. Many buyers find the telepathic contact enhances the dining experience. Feeling your meal's emotions while consuming it adds an extra dimension of satisfaction. Jake felt sick at the casual cruelty, but he moved closer to the containment field and placed his palm against the energy barrier near where the girl had positioned her hand. The psychic contact intensified, and suddenly he was receiving flashes of information. Her name was Zara. She'd been captured during a raid on a Solari agricultural colony, and she retained enough strength to assist in an escape attempt if someone could get her out of the secured compound. The mental contact lasted only seconds, but it conveyed volumes about her situation and her captor's methods. Zara had been systematically tortured and starved in attempts to break her psychological resistance, but Solari neural structure made true submission literally impossible. Her species would die before accepting permanent captivity. "Fascinating," Jake said aloud, maintaining his cover while processing the intelligence Zara had shared. "How long can specimens maintain this level of?" Jake's assault on the Korthak Syndicate compound began at 200 station time, when security personnel were at their least alert and surveillance systems underwent automated maintenance cycles. He approached through the cargo handling areas, using his legitimate access credentials to get within striking distance of the holding facilities before anyone realized his true intentions. The Wanderer's cargo loading system provided the distraction he needed: hydraulic malfunctions and power surges that Jake had carefully programmed sent alarms throughout the docking complex, while creating enough chaos to mask his approach to the compound's outer perimeter. Station security focused on the apparent industrial accident, while Jake slipped through maintenance corridors toward Zara's location. His military training proved invaluable as he navigated the facility's security measures, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional impact of seeing the captive Solari up close. Children and teenagers pressed against their containment barriers with expressions that mixed hope and terror, their natural luminescence dimmed by malnutrition and abuse. "Zara," Jake whispered as he approached her cell, his voice barely audible above the compound's ambient noise. She was waiting at the front of her containment area, her silver hair matted with sweat but her posture radiating the same unbroken defiance that had marked their first encounter. When she saw him, her eyes widened with disbelief that someone had actually come for them. "You're really here," she said telepathically, the mental contact carrying emotions that human language couldn't convey: gratitude, amazement, and something that might have been the first genuine hope she'd felt since her capture. "I promised," Jake replied, working to override the containment field's security protocols with equipment he'd improvised from cargo handling systems. "Can you help the others stay calm during extraction?" Zara's psychic abilities reached out to the other captives, projecting reassurance and coordination instructions, while Jake fought to disable cell systems that had been designed to contain beings with supernatural mental powers. The process took longer than he'd anticipated, and alarms began sounding as security personnel discovered the breached perimeter. "Company's coming," Jake muttered, finally succeeding in collapsing Zara's containment field. "How many others can we extract?" "All of them," Zara replied with fierce determination, moving to assist with the other cells. "Solari, don't abandon our people." The next 10 minutes blurred into controlled chaos as Jake and Zara fought to free 17 captives, while Syndicate security forces converged on their position. Zara's psychic abilities proved invaluable for coordination and confusion tactics. She could sense guard positions through walls and project false sensory information that sent pursuers in wrong directions. "This way," Jake called, leading the group of freed Solari through maintenance corridors toward the docking bay, where the Wanderer waited with engines already warming for emergency departure. The youngest captives were barely strong enough to walk, requiring assistance from older children who moved with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to surviving impossible circumstances. Syndicate forces blocked their direct route to the ship, forcing Jake to fight a running battle through station corridors while protecting 17 malnourished aliens who had no combat experience. His military training kept them alive through the initial encounter, but ammunition and time were both running short. "Jake," Zara projected telepathically, "I can sense their tactical coordination. They're trying to surround us. Can you disrupt their communications?" Jake asked while returning fire from behind an improvised barricade that provided minimal cover for his charges. Zara's response came in the form of psychic interference that sent Syndicate forces into confusion as their coordination collapsed. Jake seized the opportunity to push toward the docking bay, carrying 2 of the youngest Solari while the others supported each other in their desperate flight toward freedom. The Wanderer's cargo bay represented sanctuary, but Jake realized that his fuel calculations had been optimistic. 17 additional passengers meant life support requirements that would drain power reserves even faster than anticipated. They would have enough fuel for one hyperspace jump, but reaching any inhabited system was now purely a matter of hope and navigational luck. "Everyone aboard," Jake called as Syndicate forces regrouped for another assault. Zara, can you coordinate life support requirements while I handle departure procedures? Her psychic abilities allowed her to sense the other Solari's physical condition and communicate their needs without spoken language, an invaluable asset for managing resources during their escape. Jake marveled at her competence despite months of captivity and abuse. Zara's leadership capabilities were reasserting themselves now that she had people to protect. The Wanderer lifted from Nexus Station's docking bay under fire from Syndicate security forces, her hull taking damage that compromised non-essential systems but left critical functions operational. Jake pushed the engines beyond safety parameters, knowing that component failure in hyperspace would be instantly fatal, but seeing no alternative to maximum acceleration. Hyperspace jump in 30 seconds, Jake announced over the ship's intercom. Everyone find something to hold onto. The transition to faster-than-light travel felt different with 17 additional souls aboard. The Wanderer groaned under loads she hadn't been designed to carry, her systems straining to maintain life support for a passenger complement that exceeded her rated capacity. In hyperspace, Jake finally had time to assess their situation properly. Food stores would last maybe a week if rationed carefully, water recycling was operating at maximum efficiency, and fuel reserves showed exactly what he'd calculated, enough for one more jump, possibly two if he pushed the engines to destruction. "Where are we going?" Zara asked, approaching the bridge where Jake was studying navigation charts with growing concern. "Good question," Jake admitted. "I was hoping you might know of Solari settlements or friendly species that could provide assistance. My knowledge of this region is limited to trade routes and commercial stations." Zara studied the star charts with the intense focus of someone whose species possessed natural navigation abilities, enhanced by psychic awareness. "There," she said, pointing to a system that Jake's charts showed as uninhabited. "Solari rescue ships patrol that region, searching for trafficking victims." "How far?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "2 jumps at minimum," Zara replied. "Maybe 3 depending on hyperspace conditions." Jake stared at the navigation display, running calculations that all reached the same impossible conclusion. They didn't have fuel to reach the rescue ships. Life support couldn't sustain 17 people for the time required, and turning back to surrender wasn't an option that would save any lives. "We're not going to make it," he said quietly, stating the facts with military directness. Zara placed her hand on his shoulder, her psychic abilities sensing his emotional state with clarity that human empathy couldn't match. "Jake," she projected telepathically, "you saved our lives. Whatever happens next, you gave us freedom instead of slaughter." Looking around the cramped bridge at the Solari children who were experiencing their first moments of safety in months, Jake realized that success couldn't always be measured in survival statistics. Sometimes courage meant accepting certain death in order to give others a chance at dignity, even if that chance was slim. "Set course for the patrol region," he told Zara. "We'll make it as far as we can. Maybe your people will find us in time." As the Wanderer jumped to hyperspace on her next-to-last reserves of fuel, Jake understood that he'd traded his ship, his livelihood, and probably his life for the slim possibility of saving 17 aliens from becoming someone's exotic meal. It was, he reflected, the best trade he'd ever made. The Wanderer drifted in empty space between star systems, her engines cold and her fuel tanks reading absolute zero. Jake had pushed the hyperspace jump as far as physically possible, but their final position fell short of the patrol region, where Solari rescue ships might find them. Life support systems operated on emergency power that would last maybe 18 hours before complete failure. In the main cabin, 17 Solari survivors huddled together with the natural closeness of a telepathic species facing death. Their psychic abilities allowed them to share emotional support and mental comfort in ways that humans couldn't experience, but even collective consciousness couldn't overcome the reality of failing life support in empty space. "How long?" Zara asked Jake as he completed his final systems assessment, though her psychic abilities probably already told her the answer. Oxygen runs out first, Jake replied honestly. Maybe 16 hours at current consumption rates. Less if we exert ourselves trying to repair systems that can't be fixed without parts we don't have. Zara translated for the younger children, her telepathic communication carrying reassurance alongside the factual information. Jake watched the group's emotional dynamics through their subtle luminescent responses. Fear was present, but so was gratitude for freedom and acceptance of death as preferable to the fate they'd escaped. My people have concepts that don't translate well into human language, Zara said, settling beside Jake on the bridge. But the closest equivalent would be honor death, dying free rather than living in shameful captivity. That seems like a cold comfort when you're 17 years old, Jake replied, studying sensor readings that showed nothing but empty space in all directions. Perhaps, but you gave us choice, Jake Morrison. For the first time since our capture, we could decide our own fate rather than having it imposed by others. Zara's psychic presence touched his mind with emotions that carried depths human psychology couldn't access. That gift is worth more than continued survival under degrading conditions. Jake found himself humbled by the philosophical sophistication of someone barely old enough to be considered adult by human standards. Solari culture clearly prepared their youth for moral complexities that human society often avoided discussing until much later in life. "I'm sorry I couldn't get you all the way to safety," he said, the weight of incomplete success pressing against his consciousness. "You got us to freedom," Zara corrected. "Everything else is fortune that we cannot control." Hours passed in quiet conversation as life support systems gradually failed and oxygen levels declined toward critical minimums. Jake shared stories of his military service and civilian cargo operations, while Zara described Solari society and the agricultural colony where she'd grown up before the trafficking raid that had destroyed her community. "Your species confuses us," Zara admitted as their final hours approached. "Humans are capable of both tremendous cruelty and remarkable selflessness, sometimes within the same individual. It makes you unpredictable in ways that challenge our understanding of interspecies relationships." "We confuse ourselves most of the time," Jake replied with tired humor. "I'm not sure anyone really understands human nature, including humans." Emergency lighting had dimmed to conserve power when Zara suddenly straightened with focused attention that Jake recognized as psychic awareness, beyond normal sensory range. "Something's coming," she announced, her mental abilities reaching out across distances that conventional sensors couldn't detect. "Solari ships moving fast in our direction." Jake checked his instruments, which showed empty space with no sign of approaching vessels. But Zara's certainty carried conviction that made him prepare the ship's emergency beacon despite the power drain it would cause. "How long until they reach us?" he asked. "Soon," Zara replied, though her expression carried concern rather than relief. "But maybe not soon enough. Our telepathic distress calls reach them, but they're pushing their engines beyond safe parameters to get here in time." The final hour stretched endlessly as oxygen levels dropped toward the point where consciousness would begin to fail. Jake found himself drifting in and out of awareness, while Zara used her psychic abilities to maintain mental contact with the approaching rescue ships, guiding them toward the Wanderer's position with telepathic precision that conventional navigation systems couldn't match. "There," Zara whispered as shapes began resolving on Jake's sensors. Sleek vessels with organic curves that suggested Solari design philosophy, integrated biological principles with advanced technology. The rescue ships arrived with minutes to spare, their advanced systems restoring the Wanderer's life support, while medical teams provided care for passengers who had been close to asphyxiation. Jake watched Solari rescuers work with efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in recovering trafficking victims. Their telepathic coordination eliminating the communication delays that would have complicated human rescue operations. Captain Morrison, the Solari rescue commander, approached Jake as medical teams finished their initial assessments. "I am Fleet Singer Corvith,"